So this is the Vaccination Guidelines group that worked on those guidelines and the information we're going to discuss today. As you can see, it's a fairly small committee of experts in this area. So I have the honour of chairing the group. And the other members of the group are Professor Marian Horzenek, who, of course, was a very famous, worldwide recognised veterinary virologist who participated very actively in these guidelines, and as many of you will know, very sadly passed away towards the end of last year. Professor Ron Schultz from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the States is a veterinary immunologist who spent most of his career working on dog and cat vaccines. And some of you may also know Professor Richard Squires, who works in Queensland in Australia. Richard's a veterinary internist with a particular interest in immune disease, infection, and immunology. So we were the four wise monkeys that spent most of 2014-15 working on the guidelines that we're going to talk about this evening. So the WSAVA guidelines were obviously very challenging to put together because we were looking not just at North America, not just at Europe, not just at the UK, but at all of the 86 different member countries that belong to the World Small Animal Veterinary Association. And incidentally, we estimate that currently we represent something like 200,000 veterinarians in those different countries. So how do you put together a set of global guidelines that can be used by 200,000 veterinarians in 86 different countries? And the simple answer is you almost can't. It's an impossible task to produce one set of guidelines that will work in every context, that will work in London and will also work in a village in rural China. So it is an impossible thing to produce a set of guidelines that is globally applicable. So the WSAVA guidelines, people often get the misconception that these are the law. This is the rule of vaccination according to WSAVA. And it's not. What the guidelines are essentially is an information document. It's a distillation of the scientific literature and information that provides factual information about vaccination that we expect will be adapted differently in those 86 member countries. So what we're going to talk about this evening is how we might think about adapting the contents of the WSAVA guidelines for use in the UK setting. The guidelines are a very long document. If you have ever downloaded them, they go over about 45 pages of very small print. So it will take a while to sit and go through them. But it is a worthwhile exercise. There is a lot of information there. Probably one of the most useful parts for practitioners are actually the frequently asked questions at the end. And there are now 110 of those with their answers. And they will be some of the questions that many of you might have already or might want to ask as we come towards the end of this evening's session. What you see on the screen here really are the key take-home messages from the vaccination guidelines, the current key features or key points about vaccination. And I'm just going to read them now, and this slide will appear again at the very end of the presentation, by which time it will be very obvious what I mean by them. So the first statement says that we should aim to vaccinate every animal with core vaccines. And I'll explain what that means and what we mean by a core vaccine as we go through. And the second part of the statement says that non-core vaccines, again, I'll explain those, should be given no more frequently than is deemed necessary. And we'll certainly explain what we mean by those two statements. So some things about the 2015/16 guidelines. For the very first time, these are evidence-based. And I'm sure most of you are very aware of evidence-based veterinary medicine. It's talked about a lot. It's not a difficult concept. It simply means that everything that we do in practice should be grounded in good scientific evidence. So if we switch from one surgical technique to another, the switch should be based on the fact that there is good peer-reviewed scientific evidence that says that the new technique is a better way of doing that surgery. And so it is in vaccination as well. So what we'd like to think is that the recommendations we make, the changes we make, are based in good science. What we did when we produced the guidelines was to try to support the recommendations that we make in the document with a category of evidence, and this is often done in evidence-based veterinary medicine. It tells you how strong the science is, how strong the evidence is behind that particular recommendation. And we developed our own categorization system on a 4-point scheme, as you can see here, which shows you the increasing strength of evidence from category 4 at the bottom, which is not very strong at all, through to category 1 on the top. So if you do look at the guidelines document, you'll often see at the end of sentences in brackets EB1 or EB3, which just gives you an idea of how strong we believe the scientific evidence is to support the recommendation that is made in that sentence. So that's just to explain that aspect of the guidelines to you. Now, what I think you will probably find even more useful than the actual guidelines document, which, as I said, is very long, is this paper, which I wrote earlier this year in practice, and some of you may well have seen it already. And what it is an attempt to really do what we're doing this evening, and to pull out of the WSAVA guidelines aspects which are relevant to the UK and how these guidelines might be used and adapted for use in the UK. Again, if you don't happen to have that copy of In Practice lying around, the paper is actually, again, on the WSAVA website in the Vaccination Guidelines group section of the website, so you can find it there to download. And if you want to do some follow-up reading from this evening's webinar, then I'd certainly recommend that as a source of information to go to. So the way that we're going to talk about vaccination this evening, I've broken it down into 10 different discussion points, 10 fundamental concepts in vaccinology. They're in no particular order, but we're going to work through them and talk a little bit about each in turn. And this is the first one, and it really is a very important and very basic point about vaccination, that our aim as veterinarians should always be to vaccinate more animals. So what do I mean by that statement? Well, it relates to an immunological stroke epidemiological concept that we call herd immunity. And herd immunity isn't rocket science. If you look at a herd of cattle, herd immunity simply says that if you can make sure that that herd of cattle is well vaccinated, and a minimum number or percentage of that herd is vaccinated, then depending upon the infectious disease, it's going to be very difficult for that disease to get into the herd and spread amongst the animals if a high proportion of them are vaccinated. The actual number varies depending upon the disease, depending upon the infectious agent, depending upon the herd. But we could say as a ballpark, if we can ensure that 75% of that herd are vaccinated, it's going to be very difficult for many infectious diseases to get into and spread amongst that herd. So herd immunity clearly got its name from considering production animal vaccination and protection. But of course, there are many different types of herds. The human herd, the human population in any one country or city is considered as a herd from this perspective. And people talk about population or herd immunity for people as well. Now, most of us don't deal with large animals. We are small animal veterinarians. And of course, our herd are the dogs and cats that we are responsible for, the dogs and cats that live in our village, in our city, in our practice area. And our aim, of course, should be to try to maximize the number of dogs, the number of cats in our geographical location that are vaccinated and protected. And if we could do that, we reduce the likelihood of infectious disease outbreaks getting into and spreading amongst our herd. So we don't really have good figures for what the ideal level of herd immunity, the ideal percentage vaccination uptake would be for many dog and cat infectious diseases. It's probably in the order of 60 to 70%. And actually, probably if you think about it, we have yet to achieve even those levels of herd immunity in many dog and cat populations, even in developed countries. There is one disease and one situation for which we actually know very precisely what the herd immunity figure is for dogs, and that is to do with canine rabies virus infection, which of course is still a major disease that currently is estimated to kill a minimum of 59,000 people every year in the world, mostly in Africa and in Asia. Most of the people that die from canine rabies are children, because they're the ones that are most likely to be bitten by rabid dogs. And if you work out the statistics, somewhere in the world, every 9 minutes, a child dies from canine rabies infection, which is tragic in 2017, when, of course, this is a completely vaccine-preventable disease. Now, we know that when we undertake a mass vaccination campaign in Asia or in Africa, there is a magic number that we need to achieve in terms of vaccinating the dogs in that community, in that village in Africa, in that town in India. And the magic number is 70%. And we know this from many scientific studies that very clearly show that where you can achieve 70% vaccination coverage of the dog population, you can control canine rabies. You will reduce and prevent the transmission of that disease in the population. That's very clearly shown with this graph here, which is data that comes from Tanzania in Africa, that shows you that in a rural African village setting, where you manage to achieve this 70% vaccination uptake, the incidence of rabies in dogs, the incidence of rabies in people, then disappears completely. So understanding herd immunity is actually very important. Applying herd immunity is very important. Maximizing vaccination coverage in our populations is very important. Okay, the second fundamental concept is the way that we think about the multiple vaccine products that are now available on the market. And the way that the WSAVA Guidelines does this is to consider them all generically. We don't look at different manufacturers and different products by trade name. We look at the products generically. And we categorize them basically into three groups. And I'm sure many of you have heard this terminology because it's been around now for quite a while. We talk about core, non-core, and not recommended vaccines. So core vaccines are actually very simple. These are ones which every single dog and every single cat in the whole world, no matter where or how they live, should receive, because these vaccines protect dogs and cats against infectious diseases which are potentially lethal, could kill them, or diseases which have a high morbidity and can make their lives a misery. So core vaccines go into every single dog and every single cat in the whole world. There is no question, there's no discussion about that. The brackets there, or legislation may dictate, specifically refers to rabies vaccine, which of course in rabies endemic countries is legislated by law that dogs usually, and sometimes cats, must be vaccinated against rabies. So that's what that little bracket there means. A non-core vaccine, by contrast, is one which not every single dog and every single cat in the entire world needs to receive. Maybe because that particular infectious disease doesn't even exist in that country, in that region. Or maybe because the lifestyle of that individual dog or cat does not place it at risk of coming in contact with that particular infectious disease. And we'll talk about some examples of this as we go through the webinar. The final and smallest category is one called not recommended, and it might surprise you to learn that actually in some parts of the world, there are vaccines that are sold commercially, which the Vaccination Guidelines group does not recommend are used in practice, simply because there is insufficient scientific evidence base to support the use of those products in practice. So let's take a look generically at the main dog vaccines available throughout the world. It's not a complete list. These are the ones which we focus on because of their global availability, broken down into those categories. So the core vaccines for the dog, the ones which we don't even have to think about, the ones which every single dog in the UK, every single dog in every single country in the whole world needs to receive, are those that protect against canine distemper virus, canine adenovirus, and canine parvovirus type 2. Our three core viral vaccines for the dog. And of course, in a rabies endemic country, that vaccine would be a core vaccine as well. The non-core vaccines, which not every single dog in the whole world needs to receive, are those that protect against canine parainfluenza virus, Bordetella bronchoseptica, Borrelia, Lyme disease, and Leptospira. And In some countries of the world, you can still obtain vaccines against canine enteric coronavirus, and this is the one that we don't recommend because there's insufficient evidence, firstly, that that virus is actually a primary enteric pathogen in the dog, and secondly, that the vaccine can actually confer any protection from that disease. These are the main feline vaccines available throughout the world, again broken down into those categories. The core vaccines for the cat, the ones which every single cat in the UK, every single cat in every single country in the world needs to receive, are those that protect against feline parvovirus, feline panleukopenia, feline herpes virus type 1, and feline calicivirus. And in rabies endemic countries, cats should also be vaccinated against rabies. The non-core vaccines that not every single cat in the whole world needs to receive are those that protect against feline leukemia virus, chlamydia felis, bordetella bronchoseptica, and feline immunodeficiency virus, which is not a vaccine that we have in Europe or the UK. In some parts of the world, you can still buy vaccines that are supposed to protect against feline infectious peritonitis, coronavirus. These vaccines are not recommended, again, because there is insufficient scientific evidence to suggest that they actually work. So that's our categorization of core and non-core vaccines. And as I've said, the core vaccines are very simple because every dog and every cat needs to receive them. So every dog gets distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus. Every cat gets parvovirus, herpes virus, and calicivirus. The more challenging decisions, therefore, relate to the so-called non-core vaccines. And how do we figure out which dog or which cat might need to receive these particular vaccines? Again, the sorts of things we think about are geographical location. Does that disease exist? Is it an important disease? What's its prevalence? What's the risk of the animal coming in contact with that disease? And the lifestyle of the particular animal. Does that animal lead a lifestyle which is going to put it in risk of coming in contact with that infection? So as an example, we can look at these photographs here. If you look at the one on the right-hand side, we've got that cat sitting on the kitchen table, which is a solitary, indoor-only dwelling cat that lives in that house and never leaves the house except for once a year when it goes to visit the veterinarian. The cat belongs to an elderly couple who are retired. They don't travel anywhere. The cat never goes into a boarding cattery. It is a truly indoor-only solitary cat. We compare that grey cat to one over here, which is clearly part of a multi-cat indoor-outdoor household. So based on the lifestyle, the geographical and exposure risk of those animals, which one would we give a feline leukemia virus vaccine to, for example? And I think the answer clearly would be these animals here in the multi-cat situation are at greater risk of exposure. Therefore, it would be much more sensible to vaccinate them rather than the cat, which is at very low risk of coming in contact with feline leukemia virus. So here's a dog example. So here we've got two dogs. Again, the dog on the right-hand side is an apartment-dwelling dog that lives in an inner city. Once every day, at precisely 5 p.m., that dog goes downstairs, walks once around the apartment block, and goes back upstairs again. Once a year, it goes to see the veterinarian. It never goes into a boarding kennel. It is, to all intents and purposes, an indoor dog. We compare that one to the one on the left-hand side, which, as you can see, is a rural dog that lives on a dairy farm and every weekend goes off hunting ducks with its owner, rushing through the muddy water. We say, which of the two dogs would we logically give a leptospira vaccine to? And I think you would agree. I hope that based on the lifestyle, the predicted exposure risk, it would be the dog on the left-hand side rather than that on the right that is the one that we might think specifically about a leptospira vaccine. Just while we're talking about lepto vaccines, let me just digress for a moment and say a few words about them. One thing we're often asked is, why does the WSAVA put leptospira as a non-core vaccine, when in the UK every dog gets it? Well, it goes back to what I was saying about what the WSAVA is and what the guidelines are. They are global. And, believe it or not, there are some parts of the world where leptospirosis does not exist as a disease. in much of Australia, in certain parts of the United States. So we cannot say that leptospira is a core vaccine globally, because there are dogs in many parts of the world that do not need to receive that vaccine because the disease does not exist. What we want people to do is to adapt the WSAVA guidelines for national, regional use. And so what we would assume and hope, and what has of course happened in the UK, is that leptospira is considered a core vaccine here. I have absolutely no problem with that. Leptospirosis exists in the UK as a disease. Dogs should be protected. It's an important, potentially lethal disease that has zoonotic implications. So, as I'm sure most of you are aware, there has been a recent change in leptospira vaccines. For many decades, we had a so-called two-way vaccine, which contained very traditional components, canicola and Icteria hemorrhagiae. That's now changing, and in different parts of the world, we're seeing either so-called L3 or L4 vaccines emerging. And there are different L4 vaccines in different parts of the world. So the one that we have in Europe is a different L4 vaccine to the one that they have in North America. And these vaccines have been formulated specifically to include new serogroups, serovars, that are relevant geographically to the regions in which they are sold. And it just so happens that the European L4 vaccine includes, as one of the new serovars, this one called Bratislava, which is present in the United Kingdom, which has been, as I think you saw a moment ago from these slides, a cause of localized outbreaks in the southwest over the last 2 or 3 years. So people often say or ask, should I switch from an L2 to an L4 vaccine? The take from the WSAVA Vaccination Guidelines group is very clear on this. Absolutely. If there is a chance of conferring broader immunity, even cross-protective immunity, by using an L4 vaccine, then that is a desirable thing to do. So I would certainly encourage you to consider, if you haven't already, switching from an L2 to an L4 vaccine. As I'm sure many of you are also aware, about a year ago, there was a completely fictitious story that appeared in a tabloid newspaper suggesting that the introduction of this vaccine had caused thousands of deaths of dogs across the UK. That information was fabricated. It was roundly discredited by both the Veterinary Medicines Directorate and the manufacturers of the vaccines. And so there is absolutely no credibility to that. And there is no evidence at all, scientific evidence, that L4 vaccines confer any greater risk of adverse events than the L2 vaccines that they are largely replacing. Okay, our fourth point is one which is important in the background of vaccination and vaccinology, and it's about disease surveillance. So infectious disease surveillance basically is a way of tracking where infectious diseases are, where are the hotspots for infectious disease, how is the prevalence changing in these areas. And of course, in human medicine, that's really important. And the WHO and the CDC are organizations that produce these disease distribution maps, which show you very clearly across the world in different countries whereabouts infectious diseases are. This is actually quite a nice example. What you see here is the distribution of Lyme disease, Borrelia infection in people in North America. It hasn't changed much at all since 2002. So this is a disease that occurs in the northeast corner of the country. And the reason for that, very simply, is because this is where, in the forests, you find the Ixodes ticks that transmit Borrelia. So if you superimpose on that map the current map of where Borrelia infection occurs in dogs in North America, it looks identical. So dogs get Borrelia infection in this part of the country, again, related to their exposure to the ticks that carry the organism. So Borrelia, Lyme disease, is a non-core vaccine. So if you were a veterinarian that practiced over here in whichever state that was white, why would you give a dog that lived in that state a Borrelia vaccine when the disease doesn't even exist in your state? And that's why it's a non-core vaccine. However, what if the dog that came into your practice in this state was a dog that every summer flew with its owners over here to spend 2 weeks in a forest in a log cabin, then it would be perfectly sensible for you to vaccinate that individual dog because of its individual exposure risk with a Borrelia vaccine. And so this is what we mean by this decision-making for non-core vaccines. So how do we get that sort of information about dog and cat infectious diseases across the world or even in the UK? Well, it's difficult, but we do have some ways of doing it. There are some very simple schemes that are run by often vaccine manufacturers. This is one that's run by MSD Animal Health. It's called CICADA, which is an acronym that stands for something I can never remember. And it's a very simple practice-based system where your practice joins the scheme. If you identify a dog with parvovirus in your practice, you upload that case into the database, and it produces these very simple disease distribution maps that show you where the large numbers of cases are occurring. It is a simple scheme. The data are relatively few in number. The quality of the data can sometimes not be great because they're not all necessarily diagnosed by PCR. Some of them may just be diagnosed clinically. But it is a start, and it is a way of trying to track the changes in infectious disease prevalence. A much more powerful way of doing it is actually through systems such as SAVSNet, the Small Animal Veterinary Surveillance Network, or the VetCompass scheme, which I'm sure, again, many of you have heard about. And what these schemes do is to capture data, in the case of SAVSNet, directly from practice management software, but also from diagnostic laboratory databases. And SAVSNet, in the last year or so, have begun to produce quarterly small animal infectious disease surveillance reports. And that now, uniquely in the UK, gives us very good quality data based on large numbers of cases, which are laboratory confirmed cases of infectious disease, to know where some of the key dog and cat infectious diseases are and where they are of greater prevalence. So what you see here, for example, from 2013 through 15, are data related to canine parvovirus distribution in the UK. And you can see that the numbers and the quality of this data are much, much greater than you could achieve with a very simple commercial computerized system. Okay, our fifth discussion point. Let's go back to core vaccines. What are they? For the dog, distemper, adenovirus, parvovirus. For the cat, parvovirus, herpes virus, calicivirus. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but one of the big shifts in vaccination, of course, has been the move away from giving these core vaccines annually, every year, to giving them no more frequently than every 3 years in the case of the dog, and with a proviso that we'll talk about in the case of the cat. So what is the science behind this? What is the basis for this change? Why have we changed in the last 10 to 15 years, and why have we done this? Well, it relates to an increased understanding, an improved understanding of how well these vaccines can protect animals and how long that protection can be conferred for. What we talk about is a correlate of protection. Is there something we can measure in a dog or a cat that shows that it is protected from infectious disease? And it just so happens that for the 4 diseases you can see listed here, distemper, parvo, and adenovirus infection in the dog, and parvovirus infection in the cat, we have a very simply measured correlate of protection, and that is the presence of antibody, virus-neutralizing antibody, in the blood. We can say that if a dog has antibody in its blood against canine distemper virus, it is protected from that disease. It cannot get distemper, it cannot get sick, and it cannot die. And it doesn't actually matter how much antibody is there. This is a misconception that we have this magic number or titer that we need to achieve. The WSAVA guidelines talk about this. It is the presence or absence of antibody which is important. So that's very useful, and we can use antibody to monitor protection and monitor how long protection lasts for. So there are 2 graphs that you can see here that relate to what we call the duration of immunity, or DOI, of a vaccine, which simply says if you give a vaccine to a dog today, how long does it protect for? How many years is that animal protected for? And this, on the right-hand side, is what we now know about the core vaccine antigen components for the dog, distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus. What you see here is an experimental study where a bunch of puppies were vaccinated appropriately as puppies. We'll talk about that in a little while. And then they never had another booster vaccine for the rest of their lives. They didn't get one annually. They didn't get one every 3 years. They never had another one. So what happened to this protective antibody, this correlate of protection? Did the antibody disappear after a year, making them susceptible? Did it wax and wane and go up and down? No, what you can see here is measurements of the antibody levels every year for 15 years of those dogs' lives, and it plateaued. It remained the same. These animals were vaccinated as puppies. They developed protective immunity. That protective immunity lasted for the life of the puppy. So we know that the core modified live virus vaccines for the dog, distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus, confer incredibly robust and long-lived protective immunity. That is not the case for our non-core vaccines. So here's a non-core vaccine. On the left-hand side, a leptospira vaccine. We know that if we give a dog a lepto vaccine, it will make an antibody response. It will seroconvert, but very rapidly, within weeks, that antibody response will decline, and it may well be that within the course of the 12 months that that vaccine confers protection to the dog, the animal is actually seronegative, because there is not any correlation between the presence of antibody to leptospira and protection from disease. It doesn't work in the same way as for the modified live virus vaccines. So historically, when we first developed vaccines like distemper vaccines for the dog in the late 1950s, they had to go through a licensing process, and manufacturers had to prove that they had the ability to confer immunity for a period of time. And way back in the 1950s, a bunch of guys sat down in a room and said, well, we have to do this study. We have to take some puppies and vaccinate them. We have to wait a little while and prove that the vaccines protected the dogs. So how long will we wait? And someone said, well, let's wait for a year. And everyone thought that was a good idea. So they vaccinated some puppies. They waited a year. They challenged them with distemper. Nobody got sick. That was fine. The vaccine protected for a year. And the vaccines all got licensed with a licensed duration of immunity of 1 year. That was only ever the minimum duration of immunity. Nobody ever thought to look for what the maximum duration of immunity was for these particular vaccines. Now, when we in vaccination guidelines groups about 20 years ago started coming up with the thought that these vaccines actually provided protection for a lot longer than 1 year, then eventually the companies decided to do some new studies. They took a bunch of puppies, they vaccinated them, they waited 3 and sometimes 4 years and then challenged them with distemper and adenovirus and parvovirus, and hey, none of them got sick, none of them died. So they relicensed exactly the same vaccines with a new minimum duration of immunity of 3 or 4 years. And right now, every dog core vaccine that you can buy in the United Kingdom will come with a minimum 3-year licensed duration of immunity. You cannot get a vaccine in the UK now that has an annual or 12-month license on it anymore. And so actually, somewhat ironically, if you are still vaccinating dogs with core vaccines every year in the UK, you are doing it off-label. So if 1 or 3 or 4 years is the minimum period of protection, what then is the maximum period? How long is our maximum duration of immunity? Well, we actually know this. We know that there are studies now that show that if you vaccinate puppies and wait up to 9 years before you challenge them, they are still completely protected. So currently our minimum duration of immunity that we know about for the canine modified live virus core vaccines is 9 years, even though the licensed duration of immunity is only 3 to 4 years. Don't forget, with all of this discussion, we are only talking about the core modified live virus vaccines, distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus. Nothing at all has changed for non-core vaccines like lepto, parainfluenza, bordetella. These still must be given every year. So if you're using a lepto vaccine, the dog has to be vaccinated every year. And we'll come back to this in just a little while. This is one of the papers that shows you some of these challenge studies. You may not be able to read the details from you're sitting in front of your screen, but this was a challenge study where puppies were vaccinated as puppies, never again as adults, and when they were up to 9 years of age, they were then challenged with intravenous distemper virus, intranasal and oral parvovirus, and not a single puppy got ill or died. So the minimum duration of immunity for experimental challenge studies is at least 9 years. There are data also for the cat that shows that the minimum duration of immunity for the 3 feline core vaccine components, parvovirus, herpes virus, and calicivirus, is actually 7.5 years, even though right now in the UK, most of our feline parvovirus vaccines carry a 3-year license. Most vaccines with herpes virus and calicivirus carry a 1-year license for those 2 components, but there is one product range that gives you a 3-year license for all 3 of the feline core viral components. So we have all moved to triennial core revaccination, certainly of dogs. It reduces the frequency of administration. It means that we're not giving unnecessary vaccines. And one of the benefits, of course, is that it therefore reduces the risk of adverse events post-vaccination. So with all that background, let's now talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how we go about vaccinating, firstly puppies and kittens, and then adult dogs and cats, according to the WSAVA guidelines. And I'll give you some example protocols of how this might be done. So we'll start by talking about puppies and kittens, and this I'm sure will be familiar to you. It's the basic reason that we give puppies and kittens multiple vaccines early in their life. And it's all to do with maternally derived antibody, MDA, this colostral immunity, the antibody that's taken in by the puppies and kittens in the first 24 hours of life. So puppies and kittens will start with protective immunity that comes from the mother, because that is a maternal protein with a finite half-life, which is about 11 days, the half-life of immunoglobulin G in dogs and cats. That means that that maternal antibody gradually degrades away over time until eventually it will completely disappear. Now, what you see here on this graph is a stylized representation of how that degradation occurs. And this graph was first produced maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and we believed it to relate to most puppies and kittens that we dealt with. So what you can see is by 2 weeks of age, we've got this high level of maternal antibody. It starts to gradually decline, and every couple of weeks it drops down a bit more, and eventually it will disappear. But we reach this little point in the middle called the window of susceptibility, where there is actually no longer enough maternal antibody left to fully protect that puppy or kitten from infectious disease, but there's still just enough left to block the ability of that puppy or kitten to respond itself to a vaccination. So for this 2-week period, that puppy or kitten is susceptible to infection over that time. And this graph has been drawn, and we've put these lines in to suggest that in the majority of puppies and kittens, this window of susceptibility is going to occur somewhere between 8 to 10 weeks of age. And we were very happy with that, and we worked out our vaccination schedules for puppies or kittens on that basis. So if we looked at that and said, when are we going to start vaccinating puppies or kittens? Well, there's probably not much point in starting before 8 weeks of age, because they're all going to have blocking maternal antibody. So let's start at 8 weeks of age. Let's give another one at a time when we know that maternal antibody's disappeared. So if we look at that graph, we'd say, well, by 12 weeks, it's all gone. So if we had a protocol where we gave one vaccination at 8 weeks and one at 12 weeks, then that's fine, because even if they don't respond at 8 weeks, they'll respond at 12 weeks. And any that don't respond, we can follow that up with a so-called booster vaccine which we'll give at 1 year of age or 1 year after that 12-week vaccine. And so for decades, we were happy with that. We said 8 and 12 weeks, that's fine. We'll give a 12-month booster. That'll catch the ones that failed to respond. And we now know that this is not correct for every puppy or kitten. And basically we know that in the case of puppies, about 1 in every 10 puppies, even at the age of 12 weeks, will still have blocking maternally derived antibody. That means that 1 in every 10 puppies that you vaccinate using an 8 and a 12-week protocol will fail to respond to that 12-week vaccine, will remain susceptible to infection until it receives a vaccine, which might be at 12 months of age or 12 months after that 12-week anniversary. Let's look at some of the scientific evidence behind that. This is one of the studies. It's a German study, as you can see. And the bottom line here is that for canine parvovirus vaccination, at 12 to 13 weeks of age, only 92% of puppies are capable of responding to the vaccine. So 1 in every 10 puppies fails to respond to a parvovirus vaccine given at 12 or 13 weeks of age. 9 out of 10 will, but 1 will not. It becomes even more alarming if we start to look at parvovirus in kittens. And here's another German study that looked at 64 kittens from 16 different litters that were vaccinated not twice but 3 times according to the current vaccination guidelines, with a final core vaccine being given at 16 weeks of age. 3 different commercial vaccines, and the kittens were tested serologically, most importantly at 20 weeks, to see whether or not they were protected. And the bottom line in this study, somewhat alarmingly, was that about a third of the kittens, even when receiving 3 vaccines, failed to respond to the vaccine. And some of the kittens in this study still had blocking levels of maternally derived antibody at 20 weeks of age. So with these new data, the new recommendations from the WSAVA guidelines, which are made very simple here and are the same for both puppies and kittens, are, as you can see here on the screen. We would recommend starting in a country like the UK, where we have reasonable animal husbandry and breeding and levels of maternally derived antibody, starting the core vaccination protocol at 8 to 9 weeks of age. We recommend a second vaccination 3 to 4 weeks later, and a third, importantly now, given at 16 weeks or older. And now, another change, for the first time introduced in the 2016 vaccination guidelines, is that we're changing the timing of what we traditionally have called the booster vaccine. And now we see that we don't use that word anymore. I'm referring now to the 4th vaccine in the puppy or kitten protocol. And we're encouraging people to give that earlier, remembering that the reason for that vaccine is not to boost or elevate or increase immune protection. That's a misconception. The reason that vaccine was given was simply to confer a primary immune response in puppies or kittens that had failed to respond to any of the vaccines given early in their life. So we argue that why should we wait a year for that immunity to happen in those individual puppies or kittens that fail to respond to any of the first 3 vaccines? What we should be doing is bringing that forward. And we're now encouraging people to think about giving that 4th vaccine at 6 months or 26 weeks of age, or sometime between 6 to 12 months of age, rather than delaying until 52 weeks of age or 52 weeks after the final vaccine in that puppy or kitten series. If you think about it, that can be readily incorporated into practice, because at 6 months of age, that will be the time when most puppies or kittens will be coming in for neutering, and that vaccine could be delivered at that particular time point. So what we see here is just one possible example of how you might vaccinate a puppy in your practice consistent with the WSAVA guidelines. So what we've got is weeks of age in the left-hand column, the core vaccines for distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus, the non-core vaccines over on the right-hand side. So we might suggest that we start with our core distemper, adeno, and parvo at 8 weeks of age, give a second one 4 weeks later at 12 weeks of age, a third one at 16 weeks of age or older, and if you wish to consider the new recommendation, to then follow that up with a fourth vaccine given at 26 weeks of age. If you gave a fourth core vaccine here, you would not give another one at 1 year of age. This replaces that 1 year booster. If you're not happy with doing that at this point in time, then it's still acceptable, of course, to give that fourth vaccine in the series at 52 weeks. But again, we encourage people to start thinking about bringing that forward. We don't really have to worry about rabies unless this puppy is going to be traveling, in which case a single rabies vaccine at 12 weeks of age is fine. WSAVA recommends that that's followed up with a booster at 1 year of age. That's not the recommendation in every manufacturer's datasheet. It does vary between the different products. The WSAVA guidelines also talk about giving a second rabies vaccine 4 weeks after the first in puppies in highly endemic areas, by which I mean a village in rural India where there are rabid dogs running around in the street, not a puppy who's going to go to France for its holidays. The non-core vaccines, you can see over here, these are some of the ones that we might consider giving in practice. For the vaccines that protect against elements of what we should be calling the canine infectious respiratory disease complex and not kennel cough, we might elect to use, for example, in this example here, an intranasal combination against canine parainfluenza and Bordetella bronchoseptica. That can be given as a single intranasal vaccination from as early as 3 to 4 weeks of age. It would be followed up with a booster at 12 months. Leptospira vaccines, which most UK dogs are going to receive, can be put into the schedule, 2 vaccines 4 weeks apart, and most conveniently they would be given at 8 and 12 weeks on the occasion of giving these 2 core vaccines, the 8 and 12-week vaccines. Again, these must be followed up with a booster at 12 months of age. The 26-week recommendation only applies to the core vaccines against distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus. So that's our puppy protocol. Here's a kitten protocol, again, completely consistent with WSAVA guidelines. Same principle, weeks of age over here. Our core vaccines for feline parvovirus, herpes virus, and calicivirus. Let's start at 8 weeks of age. Let's give a second one 4 weeks later at 12 weeks of age, and a third at 16 weeks or older. If we wish to go with the new WSAVA recommendations, we'd introduce our fourth vaccine now at 26 weeks of age rather than at 52. That's instead of, not as well as. If we didn't wish to do this 26-week vaccination, we could do it at 52 weeks. For rabies, for a traveling cat, a single vaccine at 12 weeks, a 12 months booster. We don't need to worry about FIV because we don't have that vaccine in the UK. And then what about our non-core vaccines for kittens? If we want to use a vaccine that confers protection against Bordetella bronchoseptica, again, I've used an intranasal example here that can be given as a single vaccination from as early as 4 weeks of age, followed up with a 12-month booster. If we want to give a feline leukemia virus or chlamydia felis vaccine, 2 of those 4 weeks apart, conveniently put into the schedule at 8 and 12 weeks with a 12-month booster. And incidentally, when we're making decisions about whether to use a feline leukemia virus vaccine, remember always that it's much more important to vaccinate kittens based on their predicted future lifestyle than it is to vaccinate adult cats. A couple of words about socialization, which of course is hugely important in the context of puppies, and we all now know this, and we know that we have this window of opportunity to socialize puppies, which unfortunately is the same window as the window of susceptibility for infectious disease. So we do have a risk when we're running puppy parties, when we're introducing puppies to adult dogs and other puppies, that those individual animals might be within that window of susceptibility and might still be able to become infected. So what do we do? What do we advise in this situation? Well, We have to agree that socialization is important. We need to do it. But there are some things, some very simple things that we can do to try and minimize that risk of infection. And one of the very sensible things to do would actually not to have your puppy party in the location that you can see in this picture, which is the back room of the veterinary practice. Because 30 minutes before the puppy party, the dog with parvovirus on its paws walked through that room on its way out to the kennels. So one idea is always to have these puppy parties in a neutral location. Do it in somebody's back garden or in the town hall to try and minimize that risk of exposure. Make sure all the participants, of course, puppies and older adults, are vaccinated, and continue to give the full vaccination protocol to the puppies that attend these events. Okay, so let's move on now to adult animals and talk about adult dog and cat revaccination. And here again is one possible example of an adult dog vaccination schedule, which is completely consistent with the WSAVA recommendations and with the licensed duration of immunity of vaccines available in the UK. So this is quite straightforward. We've got years of age, we've got our core distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus vaccine, and these are given certainly no more frequently than every 3 years. It is not necessary, it is not legal according to data sheets to give these vaccines annually anymore. Every 3 years is perfectly adequate. A dog traveling frequently that is being vaccinated for rabies, again, these have a licensed duration of immunity of 3 years. It's perfectly acceptable to give those every 3 years. But nothing has changed with respect to non-core vaccines. If the dog is getting a leptospira vaccine, which most dogs in the UK will be, if it's getting a vaccine to protect against elements of the canine infectious respiratory disease complex, these vaccines still need to be given every year. You must vaccinate dogs every year, but just not with everything. And that's the big difference which has occurred. Now, we've made it slightly more challenging with respect to cats, and so too has the AAFP and the ABCD, so we're all very consistent on this, and we now talk about high and low risk adult cats. And to remind you, those are high and low risk adult cats. And there are some geographical differences. In North America, for example, there are many more solitary indoor-only dwelling low-risk cats. In the UK, that's a relatively uncommon situation, and most of our cats are going to be indoor-outdoor cats that regularly visit catteries or are part of multi-cat households. Most UK cats are going to be high risk, but you will probably, on your practice books, have some that are low risk. So this is the current recommended schedule for a high-risk adult cat. Again, we've got years of age here, and here are our core vaccines for the cat, our parvovirus, herpes virus, and calicivirus. Now, being able to vaccinate in this way necessitates you using a product range that splits out the two upper respiratory components, the herpes virus and calicivirus, from the parvovirus. There is absolutely no need to give a feline parvovirus vaccine to any cat every year. That may be given no more frequently than every 3 years. And in this cycle, you can see that the parvovirus component is only going in every 3 years. That's consistent with the license for all parvovirus vaccines available in the UK. What we've got for the high-risk adult cat is actually filling in the 2 years in between with the two respiratory components, the herpes virus and calicivirus. And we believe that that is acceptable for cats that have a higher risk of exposure to these infectious agents. So actually a high-risk adult cat is getting core revaccination every year, but just not with every component. Traveling cats that get rabies once every 3 years. If we're using a non-core vaccine, a Bordetella vaccine in a cat, a chlamydia vaccine in a cat, that goes in every year. Feline leukemia virus vaccines, in contrast, do not need to be given to adult cats every year. In this example, you can see them being given every 3 years. That's perfectly consistent with WSAVA recommendations. We also are quite happy if you want to give them every 2 years, but we say that it is not necessary to give an adult cat an annual FELV vaccine. Here's our schedule for a low-risk adult cat. And you can see that this is different. So our core vaccination schedule for the solitary indoor-only dwelling cat is core vaccination every 3 years. They do not need to have the upper respiratory tract components filled in every 2 years. Actually, we probably are never going to be giving that cat a rabies vaccine because it's never going to travel everywhere. This relates to endemic countries and the legal requirements. And if that really was a solitary indoor-only dwelling cat, why would we give it any non-core vaccines at all, which is why they're all in brackets and there's a question mark up here. So the vaccination schedule for a true cat that lived in that way would just simply be core vaccination every 3 years. Okay, so I know we're possibly going to run out of time, but we've got a couple more things to discuss. And one of these is where we give vaccines to cats to try to minimize the risk of this potential side effect, which of course is the feline injection site sarcoma, or FIS, which is not a very nice lesion at all. This is one we had in our post-mortem room a couple of years ago, and you can see that not only is it a very large and aggressive-looking tumour, but it's also metastasized to the lungs in that particular animal. These lesions still occur. We do have prevalence data for them in the UK. It's something like 1 in every 12,500 cats that are vaccinated. And if you want to read more about them, this review in the Journal of Feline Medicine and Surgery from 2015 is a good place to go. So these lesions often occur in the scruff of the neck, which is where we give injections in cats. We call them injection site sarcomas because they're related not just to vaccines, but any other injectable product. And so what are the tips to try and reduce or minimize the impact of these lesions? Well, one thing we thought about in the guidelines is where is the ideal place to vaccinate a cat? If you had to deal with one of these highly aggressive, potentially metastatic tumors, as a surgeon, where would you rather remove it from in a cat? And in the 2010 guidelines, in conjunction with our surgical colleagues, we came up with the idea of giving vaccines into the skin over the lateral abdomen, which creates a much easier opportunity for removing a tumor and repairing that site. The least favored site, of course, is still that scruff of the neck, because these tumors are very infiltrative and they will grow deep down, wrap themselves around that paravertebral muscle and around those vertebral bones. So a very difficult location to remove things from. Certainly after the 2010 recommendation, a lot of people started to give injections into that lateral flank skin. It was reported to be relatively straightforward to do that, and people didn't really have particular problems. Another option is to do what they commonly do in the United States and is still in the current AAFP recommendations, and that is to give vaccines into the legs, as far distal as possible into the legs, and to split the vaccines so that feline leukemia virus vaccines are given into the left hind limb, rabies vaccines into the right hind limb, and all the others into one of the forelimbs. And the concept here, of course, is that if a sarcoma develops, it's much easier to do a leg amputation than it is to remove a tumor from that area in the scruff of the neck. We now also have another option, and this is coming from a rather good, actually, peer-reviewed, published scientific study, suggesting another option for the cat is to vaccinate into the tail as far distal as possible. Again, the concept being that if a tumor develops, then the surgical approach is much simpler. The published study that you can see here not only showed that cats seem to tolerate this procedure, but you also get seroconversion to both rabies and parvovirus vaccine following this. So what does WSAVA recommend? Well, actually, we don't recommend anything. We now leave this up to you to decide. We provide you with these different options, simply suggesting that the scruff of the neck is not the ideal place to repeatedly inject things into cats. The options are the lateral flank, the limbs, the tail, or any other site. But maybe one simple thing to do would actually just be to rotate the sites that you use, either to vaccinate all cats in the practice in this particular site this year, or keep a record in the individual animal and rotate where in that animal things are injected. So repeated injection into the same site not a good idea, and is one thing we simply do to minimize that risk. Our ninth point, which again is something new to vaccinology and new to practice in many areas of the world, is how we're now beginning to use this concept of serological testing. We talked about this earlier, the correlate of protection, to help make decisions about vaccination in practice. Now, it's not that long ago that if we wanted to know whether a dog had distemper virus antibody in its blood, we had to send a blood sample off to a lab, and they did a gold standard virus neutralization test, and 2 or 3 weeks later you may have got a result back to tell you whether or not that animal was protected. We now have the option of doing this in-house, and there are now increasing numbers of in-practice test kits that are being sold in different parts of the world to enable you to determine this relatively straightforwardly and relatively rapidly in practice. The one that's most widely available in the UK is this one called Vaccicheck, which is made by the Israeli company BioGal, and some of you may be using it already. This one is the test for the dog, which can detect the presence of antibody against distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus in the blood of a dog. And from what we said earlier on, if those antibodies are present, then that dog is protected. There is also a Vaccicheck test kit for the cat, and this is also available in the UK. At the moment, the formulation of this is changing. You may still be able to buy a kit that can test for all 3 of the feline core antigens, parvovirus, herpes virus, and calicivirus. Actually, the only one of these which gives you a correlate of protection is feline parvovirus. There is no correlation between the presence or absence of antibody to herpes virus and calicivirus in the blood of cats and protection. It's only feline parvovirus that works for. So in what circumstances might we think about using these serological tests? Well, one very simple thing we could do is to determine whether or not puppies, or kittens in the case of feline parvovirus, have actually responded to those early life vaccinations. And this little flowchart is actually in the Vaccination Guidelines. You can find it there. And so what you could do is give the first 3 core vaccines, let's say at 8, 12, and 16 weeks, wait 4 weeks, and then at 20 weeks of age, test the animal. If that animal is positive, which it probably is going to be, it is protected, it has made its own immune response to either the 12 or 16-week vaccine. And actually, because we now know that that puppy is protected, we don't need to give it a 4th vaccine. It could go straight into an adult triennial program. Of course, very rarely we might find that that puppy, or puppy in this particular example, might be negative for one of those 3 viral antigens that we've talked about. In that circumstance, what you might try to do is revaccinate the puppy, give it another vaccine, and then wait 4 weeks and retest it. If it then becomes positive, it goes down this route into the adult triennial program. If it's still negative after it's now received 4 vaccines, then it's possibly one of 2 situations. It may be that the puppy is a genetic low responder or a genetic non-responder to that particular vaccine antigen. And there's nothing you can do about that. You can't suddenly change an animal who's genetically incapable of responding to a parvovirus vaccine into one that can. That animal has to live with that risk for the rest of its life, but at least you know that because you've done the serological test. Here's another situation in which we could use serological testing. An animal that has suffered some sort of adverse reaction post-vaccination. In this case here, a dog that's developed immune-mediated hemolytic anemia 2 weeks after last being vaccinated. What are we going to do when that dog needs to receive its next core booster vaccine? Do we just give it and hope for the best? Well, what we can do now is actually to test it serologically. If that dog is seropositive 3 years later, which it probably will be because these antibodies are very persistent, as I showed you earlier, then we have evidence of protection. We don't need to run the risk of giving it another core vaccine. What about the owner that brings in an adopted dog of completely unknown vaccination history, an adult dog? Well, you might just vaccinate it, but then you might also serologically test it. And if it is positive, it's already got protection and it doesn't need to have a vaccine on that particular occasion. Remembering, of course, in that circumstance that we're only talking about the core vaccines, not the non-core vaccines, which would need to be given. And then the latest way of using serology is actually to move forward from triennial core revaccination, which everyone now is very comfortable with, to the next stage of the process, which is triennial vaccine serology. And a number of UK practices are now already doing this. It's certainly rapidly gaining popularity amongst both veterinarians and owners. And so let me just show you how this might work. And this goes back to our adult dog schedule. Remembering now we're talking only about the core vaccines. So we've given our distemper adenoparvo vaccine at 1 year of age. So instead of then at 4 years giving another one and at 7 years giving another one, we're serologically testing. There's a very, very high likelihood that at 4 years of age, that dog is still going to be seropositive to distemper adenovirus and parvovirus. It's still protected. It doesn't need another vaccine. From the graph I showed you earlier, it's highly likely that at 7 years of age, it will still be positive. So we're actually suggesting that triennial serology is acceptable, but if you are at all concerned about that, you could do the serology annually. Taking a blood sample does absolutely no harm to the animal. There's always a risk with giving a vaccine, and you can readily include that into the annual health check consultation. Here's what we might do, for example, for a low-risk adult cat. So remember, only talking about serology for the feline parvovirus component. Our low-risk adult cat would be getting our core vaccine only every 3 years. We could further minimize the number of vaccines going into that cat by testing for parvovirus. If it was positive, it wouldn't need that component. We could just give it the 2 upper respiratory tract components every 3 years. So these are some ways in which serological testing can be used in practice, and I won't have time to talk about it, but any of you who deal with shelters, these tests really have revolutionized the ability to get under control infectious disease outbreaks, particularly for distemper or parvo in animal shelters, and it's now become a very important part of shelter medicine. So I know I've gone over time, and I hope you bear with me for just a moment longer if we just finish with the 10th and final point, which really has nothing to do with the science of vaccination, but really the way that we deliver vaccination to our clients, the way that we sell this very important part of preventative healthcare. And for many, many years, we have literally sold vaccination. We have sold booster vaccines, and we've used booster vaccines as a driver to get people to come into the practice every year for an annual veterinary visit. And we've sent out reminder cards that it's time for your booster vaccine. And what we're suggesting now is changing the way that we present this reason for coming to see the vet every year, to take out the booster and the vaccine word, and to talk about an annual health check, an annual wellness visit, a preventative healthcare visit. And this is essentially preventative medicine for pets. And it is an annual visit which discusses holistically the health and well-being of that animal, talking about all the different aspects of its diet and endo and ectoparasite control and its behavioral problems and its chronic disease monitoring. And oh, by the way, whether or not this year we might give a vaccine, and which vaccine that might be. See the change in emphasis. So this is much more about business and marketing than vaccination. The health check consultation does take longer than your average consultation, but it's been proven over and over again that if you take 20 to 30 minutes to talk about the health and well-being of the pet, it also creates an opportunity to sell other goods and services to the owners. And in fact, it's been demonstrated very clearly that practice profits and business increases rather than decreases. The extreme example of this, you'll see in a moment, but this again is just a way of marketing the annual health check, the different components of it, And what you'll see here clearly is that the vaccine is being included here at cost price or less. It's not important that they're paying for the vaccine. The vaccine is not the driver, not the main reason they came to see you. The thing that is being paid for is your professional time, your time as a highly educated health professional talking about the health and well-being of that beloved animal. And in the United States, where they're much more blatant about advertising than we are, this approach is very common. Free vaccinations. And what you'll see if you look at the next line is with the purchase of an exam. So the client is paying for the examination. The vaccine is being given for free. The vaccine isn't the important thing. It's not the driver. It's not the reason that you're talking about preventative healthcare in that pet today in the practice. So apologies for going over, but this brings us to the end, and it brings us back to the slide I showed you earlier, which I hope now will make a lot more sense to you. We should aim to vaccinate every animal with core vaccines is about increasing herd immunity in our practice populations. A non-core vaccine should be given no more frequently than is deemed necessary. Is the decision-making about which non-core vaccines we give to which animals and how we actually go about using those in practice. So I know that was very quick, but I hope you've managed to see how you can adapt and use the WSAVA guidelines in a UK setting. Again, I would recommend to you the In Practice article if you want to go back and think a little bit more about that. Essentially, the tables, the protocols I showed you in this webinar are also in that In Practice paper. So thank you for staying around. And if anyone does want to ask any questions, I'm happy to do that for a few more minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael, for your webinar. I'm sure, like me, everyone watching the webinar found it very useful to have an update on this subject, and it was very comprehensive too, so thank you very much for that. We've had some questions submitted, but just before we go to questions, as I'm sure most people already know, that I love reading your feedback. So if you could spare 30 seconds to complete the feedback survey that should have popped up in a new tab in your browser, we'd be really grateful for that. And I know from reading your feedback that depending on which device you're using to watch the webinar, the survey doesn't always pop up. So if that's the case for you, please feel free to email me your feedback using stacey@thewebinarvet.com, and I spell Stacey, S-T-A-C-E-Y. We also have our annual Veterinary Trust Award survey running at the moment. So if you complete the survey and provide your contact details, you'll be entered into the prize draw to win a case of bubbly. And the stats on SurveyMonkey inform me that it typically takes people 4 minutes to complete, so it's not a long one. The link for the survey has been provided in the chat box. If you've already completed the survey, thank you very much for your contribution. Okay, so as I said, Michael, we have had some questions submitted. The first question, we have long educated our clients into the current 8 and 10/12 week protocol with a booster at 60 weeks. How do we re-educate without losing credibility and maintaining a competitive edge?
Well, I think the simple answer is the way that I portrayed it, that this is new understanding found in new science. So there have been several new studies that showed actually that in the past, like in many things in life, many things in science, we were previously incorrect. And there are certain numbers of puppies and kittens, not all of them, that will still have blocking levels of maternal immunity at 12 weeks of age. It's going to be somewhere between 1 in every 10 to above. And so we just have to try this re-education process, I think. Interestingly, when I went to vet school 40 years ago, I was taught with a protocol that involved giving 3 vaccines to puppies and kittens. And what happened was that the products became higher titer products, and we then dropped one of them out of the schedule. So actually, it is no different to what we were doing 30 or 40 years ago. It's just that most of us have been brought up just giving those 2 vaccines and then an annual booster. But the science has changed, and science continues to change. And, these may not be the final changes to the recommendations.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next question. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Are the vaccines from different companies compatible? For example, if I start the protocol with Nobivac, can I follow up with Versican?
It's a great question. It's a frequently asked question, and I'd refer you to that list of 110 frequently asked questions if you don't get yours answered this evening. I will give you a completely different answer to the manufacturers. So if you ring up a manufacturer, they will say, no, if you started with my product, you need to finish with my product. They are legally obliged to say that because they have been through a registration process with their product, and they clearly haven't mixed and matched and tested their product with other manufacturers. So the Veterinary Medicines Director at the CVMP requires them to give that answer. In the real world, immunologically, actually, it probably makes very little difference. The core vaccines for dogs and cats are very similar. There are some differences, though. If we think about lepto vaccines, if you're starting with an L2 and switching to an L4, you would probably want to give 2 doses of the L4 because there are new antigenic components in there. That's an example of where you might consider very carefully how you switch between manufacturers or indeed switch between the nature of the vaccine, L2 to L4. But in reality, if you started with one manufacturer's canine core vaccine, switching to another manufacturer's makes very little difference at all.
Thanks, Michael. As a vaccination site, is the side of the abdomen acceptable in dogs?
So interestingly, in dogs, we don't recognize injection site sarcomas. Rarely we see microchip-associated sarcomas in dogs, but these injection site sarcomas happen in cats, they happen in rabbits, they happen in ferrets, and there's been one documented case in a horse. So I think we can get away with vaccinating dogs in more traditional locations. I don't think we have the need to be more creative with the dog in terms of where we deliver vaccines.
Great, thank you. And I'll have to make this the last question, I'm afraid. Is the FELV vaccine license for a 3-year vaccine scheme?
There is not. I believe there is one which now has a 2-year license, but I don't believe that any of our UK products currently have a 3-year license. So if you are using it in an adult cat, that is off-label use. But I think you'll find that all of the vaccination guidelines and most feline specialists will support the use of feline leukemia virus vaccines in adult cats every 3 years. Remembering that adult cats develop this naturally acquired immunity to FELV, and it's always much more important to give that vaccine to kittens than it is to adult cats.
Great, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks again for your brilliant webinar. Sorry for overrunning this evening, but I think it is a really important topic, and obviously there's a lot of interest as well. Thank you to everyone who attended the live webinar. It's always great to have your company and for providing your feedback. And last but not least, thank you to my colleague Holly for co-hosting with me on the webinar today. And I hope to see you on another webinar soon. Thanks everyone, and bye.